Hi, this is Matt Ballant. Welcome to the Elevate 2021 session on the PowerBuilder Foundation classes, the PFC, what I'm calling the Lite version. Before we get started, some standard disclaimer. Any of the views or opinions expressed during the course of this session are strictly my own and do not necessarily reflect those of either Appian or my employer. Pretty simple agenda, just a quick introduction, overview, and some examples. I want to let everyone know, however, this is not a session on how to code with the PFC. That topic is way beyond, way too broad to be encompassed in one simple session. So that is not the focus here. What this session is about is taking the PFC and stripping it down into some base components that can easily be used or integrated with existing applications. Again, my name is Matt Ballant. I've been a PowerBuilder programmer since the middle 1990s. I've worked at a wide variety of corporations, both large and small. Extensive work in healthcare, insurance, materials processing, worked in the energy sector, laboratory sectors. Currently employed at Concentra, which is a healthcare provider. So, the PFC is a long-established set of libraries to serve as a foundation for applications. Originally, it was included, I believe, as part of PowerBuilder 5 and was initially enhanced as newer versions of PowerBuilder were produced. However, it really hasn't changed in the last, 15, almost 20 years. Sybase did very little to update it, and in fact they open sourced it some time ago, I believe around the time of PowerBuilder 10 or 11, and it's currently available on GitHub. Originally, the PFC recommended a structure where you had the actual coded objects, then an intermediate layer, or what was called the PFE layer, and that would be used to make any changes to the coded layer. And then even perhaps if you had corporate standards or corporate functionality you wanted to incorporate, you could further add a corporate layer on top of the PFE in order to keep all the code separate. And the idea was if the PFC objects changed due to enhancements or bug fixes, that sort of thing, they would be very easy to bring into your applications without a whole lot of refactoring. However, since really these libraries haven't changed a tremendous amount in almost 20 years, it's my belief that these need for this separate layers are really not, there's really no need for it. So what I'm going to show is how I reduce the number of libraries into basically into one, and so I could integrate the PFC into a long established and existing application suite and take advantage of the functionality of the PFC for new windows that were being developed. Here's some basic assumptions that I made. There was no need for the PFE layer. Any changes that we made were either going to be integrated directly into the PFC objects or kept in some sort of inherited corporate level. There's some services that we have absolutely no intention of using, so I wasn't going to go through the headache of migrating them. However, once you see what I did, if there is some service that you really have to have, it's not going to be very difficult for you to bring those into this Lite version of the PFC. Again, like I said, I consolidated everything into a single pibble. Now, when I first started, I tried to establish to myself, what did I really want? What are the absolutely have-to-have objects? Well, obviously I have to have an application object. I also wanted a transaction object. And the only real window that I initially wanted was just a main type window. I wasn't interested in any of the other types. I wasn't going to integrate a MDI window into this application that I was working with. I was only interested in future development of individual main style windows. So that's the only window that got migrated, was W main. Obviously I wanted the UDW, because that's one of the really, really useful pieces in the PFC. A variety of supporting services were pulled in, and a few specialty windows and objects. There's a calendar object and a calculator object and a few other things like that. Now, a couple of the tools that I used to achieve this goal. First of all, I used PB Search extensively. This is a tool provided by Roland Smith, the Top Whiz Programming, and really any serious PowerBuilder developer should own a copy of this tool. It is well worth the cost. Another tool that I happen to really like is Notepad++, but you could use any kind of similar text editor. Now, I could go through all of these objects, but I don't want to bore you with all of this stuff, so I'm going to skip down to the demo. This slide deck will be available for download after the conference, so if you really want that list, you can see it. But again, it's all just from what's in the Pibble, so there's nothing real mind-shattering there. Oh, I'm sorry, skipped ahead. This demo is being done in PowerBuilder 2019 R3, the most current version. So let's take a look here. First of all, what I did is, this is the PFC workspace and targets that are available when you download the PFC libraries from GitHub. Now, I added this bottom PFC Lite target, but I wanted to include what's currently in the PFC so you could get a better idea of what I did. Now, I'm not going to be providing this PFC library as they are, just this PFC Lite, these two pibbles. So if you want to do a setup similar to what I have, you're going to need to download the PFC and set it up on your system, and then integrate in the PFC Lite. But let's go and take a look at this, the generic PFC application here. And this is the Pibble list that you have generally. You have your PFC Pibbles, you have the corresponding PFE Pibbles. So really what you want to do is, if you're going to eliminate the PFE layer, you have to eliminate any reference to any of these objects here. And that's done in the PFC level, because the way the PFC is set up, if we look at, let's just look at a window in the PFE existing, this main is, if I look at its source, it's inherited from PFC main. And any objects on main would be inherited from corresponding objects and on the PFE layer, which are themselves derived from corresponding objects in the PFC layer. So there's quite a bit of text editing, exporting objects out, editing them, changing their references, and then re-importing, looking for any errors, fixing those errors, re-importing it. It's very time-consuming. I didn't keep a thorough log on this, but it took me a good 2 to 3 weeks time to get this to a point where I could do a full build and not have any errors. And even still, a few months later, there was some object that I hadn't changed or had an incorrect reference to it. So it took a fair amount of effort to do. So, but again, if you're going to do this, you need to export out these objects, change their references, and then re-import them. Now here's an example in this PFE main. Most of these objects I wasn't interested in. Horizontal scroll bar, list view, none of this stuff. I didn't care about any of this stuff. I figured if I'm going to need it, I'll create my own, or I can always go back to the PFC, get the original object out, change the references, and import it into my new library. But the vast majority of these objects, they're not brought forward, which makes the task much easier. So let's take a look at our PFE Lite. So this is the extent of the PFC. So we have a series of data windows, a couple of functions, menus, structures, some various non-visuals, and a few windows. So if we look at, for example, let's just look at data window filter service. Look at the source here. Now what you have to do, and what I did, is all throughout this export, you have to look for any reference to a non-PFC, the PFE object. So, like for example, this would originally have referenced NCST filter retrib. So I had to go in here, change that to PFC NCST, and so on and so on and so on. And all throughout any of the script. And this is where the PB search tool came in very handy, because you can search for these. You can do a search and replace. You can search on multiple files. So that tool came in very handy. And what I did is I established a folder. I exported objects into that folder, edited them, saved them back to the folder, and then re-imported them into my library in PowerBuilder. And if I had an error, I would go back in, re-edit it, fix whatever error I found, re-import it. And then if it imported successfully, I would go back out and delete it out of my out of my exported folder, just so I had a list. When I was in that exported folder, I knew hadn't been brought forward into the new Pibble. So that's just how I chose to tackle that task. So let's talk about a few of the kind of exceptions to this list here. Let's take a look at this grid pop-up. This grid pop-up technically isn't a PFC object. What this is used for is on grid data windows. It creates a pop-up menu to allow for some standardized functionality. One of them being like sorting ascending or descending, sort excluding the value of the column that you clicked on, the row and column that you clicked on, either excluding that or only using that as a filter to exclude or a filter to include. I also have functionality where you can widen that column. So if you have a grid data window where it's standardized width, you have information that exceeds that width, you can expand it by one mouse click to so the users can see everything in that column without having to drag and widen the column manually. There's also the ability to bring up this grid preference window, which allows the users to make columns visible or invisible, so they can change a grid to suit their work style or their workflow. You can also change the order of the columns, because I have code in my applications where I disable certain functionality based on a single click, because in a grid data window, a single click selects the entire column and turns it this black highlight color, which I do not like. And so I have code which prevents that from happening. But one of the side effects of that is you can no longer dynamically move the column order like you can in a standard grid data window. So that's why I have this option here, this grid preferences, which allows the users to change the order of their columns to support their workflow. I want to talk about this NTR PFC object. This is inherited. If we look at it, oh, I'm sorry. Let me edit the source, excuse me. It's inherited from PFC NTR, and the reason I did this is because I have coded these methods, OF begin, commit, end, and rollback, to support the style of transaction handling that I like to use in the database that I'm using where I work. And I didn't want to make these changes at the PFC layer, because let's say I have a different database system that I need to connect to that doesn't support the use of the auto commit flag. So if I put these in the base layer, obviously I couldn't have multiples, or I would have to jump through a bunch of hoops that I don't want to jump through to do that. So I did this by inheriting from that, calling it NTR PFC. This is the transaction object that I would set in my application. And then I can use a transaction handling here. Another object that some of these windows here, this WDW sort. This is the sort window where the users can take a look at this window. This is the window where, if you're allowing, again, on a grid data window, and you can have sorting on an individual column, or you can have sorting on multiple columns. And this is the window that would bring up the list of columns on that data window, the visible columns, and the user can choose, okay, I want to sort on this, I want it to be ascending, then this column descending, then this one ascending. This is that window that supports that functionality. Also wanted a response window, so that's in here. This W grid window is the window that comes up with the grid preferences, where the user can then choose, I want this column visible, I want this to be the first, this to be the second column, this to be the third column. So this again is invoked by the pop-up menu, and again it's only applicable to grid windows. This find window. Yeah, this is a search window I put in, but I really haven't used it. So I can't really comment too much on it. It doesn't really look that nice of a window anyway. I probably just put it in there just to support some underlying services. And simple filter windows. Those are also ones that I don't currently really use, but I just brought them in just in case I needed them. Now, how did I integrate this in to an existing application? Well, first thing you got to do is you got to add the Pibble to the library list of the application. On your application object, you need to create a global variable, your app manager. And again, you would probably have this as some application specific. You would inherit and create an object from the PFC app manager object. And that's the object you would use here in your application. But in this generic PFC Lite application, I didn't do that. I just inherited from the base PFC app. But you have to have a GNV app in order to integrate this in. And then beyond that, what you need to do is inherit from the PFC objects to utilize their functionality. And it's also possible, depending again on how your application has been structured, to change the ancestry of an existing window. So if you had something, you know, you had a WMyApp window that was of type main, for example, you could go in to that. Let's just bring up a window. Edit source. You know, let's say this was your window in your application, and it's going to look very similar to this, except it's not going to be PFC WMaster. It's going to be whatever your main window is. All you got to do is change from window to from PFC WMaster, and the same here. And then, assuming you don't have any method or variable duplication, boom, you're done. You just save, you're done. And then now you can take advantage of all of the resources and all of the abilities of the PFC. And I guess this would be a good segue into just showing you some of the stuff that I didn't use. Again, if you want to go through the time and effort to bring these in, by all means do so. But for example, I chose not to bring forward the window preferences. I have my own preference saving service that I've created over the years, and I'm more familiar with it, so I'd rather use it than going through the PFC version. So I chose not to bring that in. It's probably more applicable in the data window. If you look at UDW, see some of these. So I didn't bring forward linkage, reports, or multi-table, required columns, print preview. I did bring forward the calculator. I haven't implemented it though yet, so it's commented out. And this property service was also one that I chose not to bring forward. But most of the base services are there, and any place in here where I didn't bring something forward, I left the code in. I'm trying to find an example. I left the code in. I just commented it out so I would get a good compile. Like here, for example, linkage service. So these are still here. So if for some reason you want to use the linkage service, you just have to go through and find these places where I've commented out and uncommented. So all the functionality is here. Here's another linkage service one, linkage service, so it's there. Yeah, there's a lot of linkage service stuff in here. Here's print preview. So I tried not to eliminate any methods or any variables or any of those things. I just commented out the code, so in case anyone wants to use them, it would be relatively easy for them to implement them. Again, here's Epyon. Oh, one last thing I want to mention. Those of you who are interested in using the PFC, you might wonder, where do I find any documentation on this? Well, on the Epyon community in the Q&A section, if you do a search for PFC documentation, some of the users have posted PDFs of the old PFC documentation. Now, granted, it's fairly old. It's like maybe PowerBuilder 10 version. But again, the PFC hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot since then. And if you just need some basic understanding of some of the services, I'd highly recommend you download that. There's also a link in there where you can download the old Windows help file that used to be provided with the PFC. Now on the newer Windows, you'll need to download some sort of reader for it. I believe it's a CHM file, and you'll need a reader for that. But my point is that resource is also available if you want to have a help link on your desktop where you can look up PFC related stuff. Thank you very much. Oh, not really any Q&A for this. Again, it's fairly straightforward. One of the things with the PFC being open source, I kind of feel an obligation to share this, because I know there's a lot of places that, and a lot of people who would like to perhaps use some of the PFC. I've seen code where they'll strip out 2 or 3 essential pieces of the PFC. A prime example is the string service or the file service. They'll strip that out and they'll use that. There's a lot of other things you can use as well, but it's a pretty big task to go through, and a lot of trial and error, if you will, going in, changing references, bringing it back into PowerBuilder, looking for an error, going back out, fixing that, re-import it. I mean, it's a very tedious time-consuming task. But hopefully with this library that I've provided, I've at least gotten you guys that are interested in taking a look at the PFC and possibly utilizing some of its features. I've gotten you pretty much there. You know, there's still going to be, you got to go the last little steps, but at least I've done a fair amount of the heavy lifting on this. Thank you very much.